Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is another lecture video in our Introduction to Critical Theory course. This is going to be a walkthrough. I don't have a written out lecture for this just because I'm a little bit behind and I do like to write them out beforehand. But I'm just trying to get ahead. We are going to be working through a rather short essay by Emmanuel Levinas, who, as I've said in previous lectures, is certainly not considered a classic critical theorist. And it's part of my strategy, it's part of my pedagogy in this class to be giving us some various perspectives from different political angles, as we've done so far in class, with Carl Schmitt being further right, with Vladimir Lenin being further left than the Frankfurt School critics. And here we have the perspective from Emmanuel Levinas, who's a Jewish ethical philosopher. And I don't think he's coming from an angle that is easily characterized as right or left. And that is part of my reason for having us look at him. I also want us to understand the broader milieu in which these thinkers are reacting to the conditions in Europe. Now, Emmanuel Levinas is Lithuanian born, and he ends up uh, going to Strasbourg. He ends up he's living partly in Germany, and then and really spends most of his life in France after the war. He loses most of his family, except for his wife and children, uh, to the Shoah or the Holocaust, um, and has lives as a kind of obscure philosopher, I think, for most of the 20th century. Although he's super important for us for some historical reasons, mainly for being the first translator of Martin Heidegger's work from Germany into French. And so the big French thinkers that people might think of, like Jean-Paul Sartre or Merleau-Ponty, they don't, who are very much reacting to Heidegger's thought. Levinas is kind of the bridge that gives them that. But that's, of course, later on. And so this essay that we're going to read is really early on in Levinas's career. He's been enamored as a student um, with phenomenology, and particularly the work of Edmund Husserl, who's kind of the main initiating figure for phenomenology in the early 20th century, a Jewish thinker as well. And it's the end of Husserl's career, and he's leaving his career, and in comes this um, younger person, named Martin Heidegger. And so Levinas famously says, I went to Freiburg to meet and study with Husserl, but instead I encountered Heidegger. Heidegger's going to take Husserl's thought and run with it in a different direction that will be called existential phenomenology. With the French thinkers later on, it becomes existentialism, but it's existential phenomenology. Phenomenology is a method of thinking that tries to overcome the mind world problem that had characterized a kind of dualistic problem that had characterized much of continental thought, between Descartes and um, the 1920s, when these thinkers are writing and thinking, and in very, very broad terms. And there's so many nuances to the discussion, but in broad terms, you have the folks who are pushing in the Cartesian tradition towards a philosophy of mind, that says that really, the only way that we're encountering the world is not directly through the world, but through the concepts and the reflective concepts that we have that are produced in our mind by our rationality. And that is what um, produces, after Descartes, especially, this uh, um, impulse in continental thought to to say that what we're really dealing with is all in our minds. It's all in our rational representation of the world. The English tradition is going to counter this, and it's going to be empirical. The empirical tradition is going to say no. It's like everything that we get is coming through our experiences of our interactions with the world. So there's a contestation about what the role of our bodies has in relation to things. But by the time we get to really advanced thinkers on the continental tradition following Descartes, we get Immanuel Kant, we get Hegel and the idealists, we get George Berkeley, who's Irish, who are going to say things extremely like that we can't even know that the world exists outside of our own minds. Something like Berkeley is going to say. Uh, um, uh, the the back and forth is centuries long, but of course the rationalists in that tradition that Marx had been critiquing had been following that kind of the mind tradition, right? And then Hegel's phenomenology of spirit or phenomenology of mind is going to be in that tradition as well. Marx, of course, tips it on its head, and we get the positivistic turn in 19th century philosophy towards science and experimentation, which is, of course, is going to be aligned with the empiricism that's been mainly associated with English philosophers. So the liberal tradition that many of these thinkers that we've already been discussing, much of the liberal tradition comes out of English thinkers, particularly John Locke. He's not the only person, so we could go back to Hobbes and think of Hobbes as important as well. But because the English thinkers are dealing with, first of all, Protestant notions of religion, and second of all, particularly Calvinist versions of religion that are really influencing people like Thomas Hobbes, and then even still influencing John Locke, who's kind of reacting in his own way to Calvinism. It's going to produce a different mode of engagement and a mode of thinking with the world. There are other ways to characterize philosophical thought. Oftentimes, sometimes uh, you'll hear that the French philosophy deals more with the eye and German philosophy deals more with the ear. That's one way to think about it, for sure. There are different sort of characterizations, but the broad tension between mind and the world, and do we only, or is our only access to the world through our minds, or um, or does it really come through our senses, is going to be a debate about the body and what its role is in shaping our knowledge systems. Phenomenology comes along in the early 20th century, and it introduces a kind of heuristic, a thought tool called the epoche, or the phenomenological reduction. The phenomenological reduction brackets off the mind world problem and says, we're going to say, yes, the world does exist outside of the mind. We are not only just mind as humans, but because we only access the world through our embodiment, what we really, really need to understand is the apparatus of perception and feeling itself. I've mentioned Henri Bergson in a couple of earlier lecture videos. He's a really important thinker as well because he's going to give us concepts of duration and temporality. Two big concepts in Henri Bergson are going to be like the one thing that humans do is that I can think back to the beginnings of ancient Greece abstractly in my mind, right? So human thought can move to the future, to the past, it can move all over the place. But human being and situated beingness, um, Bergson will call dure, or duration, right? And a way to think of it is like, I can think back to, oh, well, the Renaissance in England or something. I can locate things very abstractly that way. And then there's the time that it takes for sugar to dissolve in water for me to make lemonade. Duration is lived experience. Phenomenologists are going to be very concerned not with abstract, detached rationality, kind of virtual logic or thought like that. Um, they're going to be concerned with how we give an account of lived experience. That's going to be a big part of Heidegger's project and his thought in his big book called Being and Time, which um, kind of changes the whole discussion of philosophy in the 20th century. One way to think of it is that Heidegger says we are in the very beginnings of philosophy, in the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus, thinkers like this, they're dealing with the meaning of life. But around the time of Socrates, there is a push towards understanding knowledge and concepts, especially in the Socratic dialogues, where they're pushing towards an abstract notion of concept. And Socrates is going to align that with eternal forms, right? Um, what is justice? So Socrates says to, let's see, in the Euthyphro, for example, they're talking about piety. And he says, if it's a matter of how many chairs are in the room, and when there's a disagreement between you and I, we can just count the number of chairs and then we will figure it out. But when it comes to concepts like piety or justice or what is the good, right? That's where we're going to really get into fights with each other. And if we're not friendly with each other first, if there isn't a common ground where we're trusting each other, then we're maybe even going to come to blows. We're going to get so angry and mad at each other. And so the discourse of philosophy, as Socrates sets it up, is going to be one based, yes, on refutation. We point out that things are wrong. We point out negation of concepts. And that's why I said earlier in a lecture, I said, like in philosophy, like the failure is fruitful, right? Like it's not just a matter of saying like, oh, the critical theorists, like their project didn't work out, so we should never talk about them again, right? That's not what philosophy does. Philosophy digs into the failure of the situation. And in at least classical philosophy and in the dialogues of Plato, um, it's not about taking somebody down, although Socrates kind of does that. He kind of points out flaws in people's thinking. The process of refutation is meant to get us towards a clearer view of what the abstract concept is, right? Modern philosophy is going to take that kind of idea and run with it and say that all we have are sort of like access to the conceptual system. That's going to be Descartes and that Cartesian tradition onwards. And that so yes, they're influenced by Plato. In fact, they've just been reading Plato during the Renaissance, which is when the Euro Christians get access to Plato again. In the late medieval times, they have access to most of Aristotle, although not the Poetics. And so they're dealing with Aristotelian logic and the scholastics with Thomas Aquinas and people like that. Later on in the Renaissance, we get this fascination with Plato and the Republic, and then we got all sorts of modern political philosophy building out of that. Heidegger says that what happens when Socrates comes along is there's a shift in philosophy away from the study of what it means to live and away from the study of ontology, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with what it means to exist. And so Heidegger says that with phenomenology, what we need to do in the 20th century is return to the question of meaning. What does it mean to be? What is an authentic life is another way of thinking of it. And so that becomes part of his project, and he's very much describing um, uh, what the subject with his name for it is Dasein. It's literally like being there. It's like a blank cursor or something on a computer screen might be a way to think of it. Um, and he will describe the structure of existence. Now, he's still describing the structure of an entity that is a kind of being there. So he's not exactly doing metaphysics where he's completely describing the external reality. The breakdown of the ability to do metaphysics in the 19th century is what brings about that Nietzschean call to say that there's the death of God. There are so many new sciences that have emerged in the 19th century that it's hard to get one metaphysical account. We could go down to atoms, we could look out at the stars, we could look at biology, we could look at psychology. There are so many different accounts that we might give to try and talk about what the nature of reality is, that it becomes hard to even talk about reality as if it were one thing. And that if metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality, the phenomenology again intercedes as a new discussion that kind of breaks uh, off or brackets that kind of conversation and says what we're going to do is we're going to study the nature of being and the structures of being. And that's where Heidegger's thought becomes really important. It's not because it's encountering the structures of being, it will be dealing with feelings and emotion. Heidegger is very influenced by this um, a Japanese philosopher who writes a book called The Book of Tea. Um, Okakuro. I'm forgetting his last name right now. I'm sorry, but if you look up The Book of Tea, and it's like actually one of his students is Japanese who turned Heidegger onto it and claims that Heidegger takes the concept of Dasein or like his main concept from Eastern philosophy, but he never credits Eastern philosophy with it. So there's that's should be out there as well, because there are other aspects of Heidegger's thought that are going to lead him to embrace National Socialism or Nazism. And this is why it's important to talk about Heidegger, because Heidegger is the teacher of many of the critical theorists, and he's the teacher of Emmanuel Levinas. And what Emmanuel Levinas is dealing with as he writes this essay is Heidegger's Being in Time comes out in like the late 1920s. All these people are enamored with it. And Heidegger is the chair of a philosophy department in Germany. And when the Nazis come into power, they demand that everybody who's in a university position be a member of the Nazi Party. Nobody blames Heidegger necessarily for joining the Nazi Party in name only. Um, but what it turns out to be is that Heidegger fully embraces, he doesn't just join the party in name only. He really sees a kind of alignment between his philosophy and what he's been describing and fascism. Now, remember, I've given an account of fascism that says that fascism embraces the irrational in a particular way. Heidegger is going to be very, very much contesting the neo-Kantians, right? Remember, Carl Schmitt hates the neo-Kantians. He associates that with liberalism. Heidegger's own thinking is going to be countering the neo-Kantians in a different way than Schmidt for sure. And but he eventually, like Schmidt, embraces Nazism and becomes a member of the party. We do now know from his Black Notebooks, which have been published in English in about the past decade, that Heidegger himself has deeply anti-Semitic views and that he seems to have believed in the Nazi Party. That used to be in question. And so sometimes people said, oh, yeah, well, Heidegger was not really a Nazi. He just joined. He never goes through a denazification process after the war, and he never apologizes for being a Nazi. There is, in fact, there's an unapologetic quality to Heidegger's own thinking. And so that is all important as a prelude to thinking about Emmanuel Levinas, because as a student whose world has been totally changed, and he's been so enamored with the thought of Martin Heidegger, like many of the critical theorists. Marcuse worked with Heidegger as well. Hannah Arendt was a lover of Heidegger's and is largely responsible for bringing Heidegger's thought after World War II to the United States. So there's an ongoing dialogue with these Jewish thinkers and this major philosopher who um, doesn't really seem to give an account of the fact that he embraces a philosophy that calls for the annihilation of his students. And what happens if you're a student who's you've come to find that your professor has that kind of attitude towards you? That's what Levinas is dealing with among the rising anti-Semitism on the continent, but especially in Germany during this particular moment when Hitler has come to power in 1933, and we start getting the first anti-Jewish laws showing up in 1934 when this essay is published. He's publishing this essay in a Catholic journal, as the prefatory note says here. Um, uh, and there has been this moment where the Catholic Church signs a concordat or an agreement. It's like a treaty with the Nazi Party, and the Catholic Church's position, and Pope Pius at this time, anyway, maybe later on in his life, he gets worried about he wants to speak out against anti-Semitism, but at least not at this moment, and he never does get to speak out. He dies, and then another Pope Pius comes in, and basically the Catholic Church is in collusion with the Nazi Party. But in the beginning of all of this, when the first anti-Jewish laws are sort of coming out on the books, the Catholic Church takes a so-called neutral stance towards the rising anti-Semitism. So, and that's not to say that all Catholic people, because there are definitely Catholic priests and bishops who are anti-Nazi, but then there are lots of people in Germany who are Catholics, and they are trying to reconcile their Nazism with their Catholicism, and writing to Pope Pius and saying, like, what you know, can you give us a statement on this? Like, what's the position that a Catholic should have with respect to National Socialism? So that's just part of the milieu, and it heightens, I think, the intensity of what Levinas is saying in this particular essay. Um, my students have had a hard time reading it this week. Levinas, so critical theory is hard to read anyway. Levinas is kind of on a whole other level, but he's also there's a quality that sometimes people say that even for his own time period, that Levinas seems like to be coming from an older time. I think that maybe is associated with him being Lithuanian and being Jewish. He speaks Russian, he speaks Lithuanian, he's Hebrew, Yiddish, so like, and then French and German. He reads Shakespeare, he reads Dostoevsky. He's very influenced by lots of different lines of thinking. So Shanahan, or this is Shanahan is the translator here, and we get this note from the beginning from Levinas that he writes this in 1990 as they're republishing it, and that's how we're accessing it, is from a republication of this essay that was originally published in 34. So Levinas himself says this article stems from the conviction that the bloody source of or sorry, that the source of the bloody barbarism of National Socialism lies not in some contingent anomaly within human reasoning, nor in some accidental ideological misunderstanding. This article expresses the conviction that this source stems from the essential possibility of elemental evil into which we can be led by logic, and against which Western philosophy had not sufficiently ensured itself. This possibility is inscribed within the ontology of a being concerned with being. Notice how Heidegger is showing up there, right? Um, a being, to use the Heideggerian expression, um, uh, dem es in seinem sein dieses sein selbst geht. I don't really speak German, so I had to just kind of guess on the pronunciation there. So such a possibility still threatens, according to Levinas here, the subject correlative with being as gathering together and as dominating. That famous subject of transcendental idealism that before all else wishes to be free and thinks itself free. Remember how I was dealing with freedom and independence at the end of the last lecture with Horkheimer? Look at what Levinas is saying here, that it is in this impulse within Western philosophy to be free and to try to think oneself or one's subjectivity as free, that there is the possibility for this deep elemental evil. So Levinas says we must ask ourselves if liberalism is all we need to achieve an authentic dignity for the human subject. Does the subject arrive at the human condition prior to assuming responsibility for the other man in the act of election that raises him up to his height? This election comes from a God, or capital G God, who beholds him in the face of the other man, his neighbor, the original site of the revelation. Now, Levinas is going to use religious language unapologetically, but he says throughout his life that he's doing philosophy. You do not need to be a believer in religion to understand the ethical conditions that he's trying to describe, but he thematizes it oftentimes by referring to instances, perhaps in Genesis in the Old Testament or something like that. To break this down a little bit more clearly, and this is with the insight of I did my master's thesis on Levinas and I've read much of his later work, but this is a really early um uh work, like in his late 20s is when Levinas is writing this. He doesn't write his magnum opus until like 1960. Um and so um he comes to articulate some of the stuff is percolating here in this essay throughout a much longer philosophical career that we now have access to. As Levinas is struggling with his teacher Heidegger, he takes a different tack and he's going to still use the language of phenomenology, which is going to lend itself to a different kind of writing that sometimes feels very poetic. Um, and it's going to feel really different than like Horkheimer and Adorno, but it's not going to be it's not going to necessarily be easy to work through, and that's why we've got to do this contextualized lecture here, just to try and understand what Levinas is saying. Now we've already noticed above that he's asked the question: Is liberalism enough? That's right there within the Weimar German tradition of critiquing liberal democracy. So Levinas says, yes, he's going to be critical of and perhaps even anti-liberalism, but that's not going to situate him, certainly not with the Nazis on the right, and certainly not with communism, as we'll see later on in this essay to the left. And so why I want to throw Levinas into our conversation here is he gives us an angle into these critiques that cannot be easily accounted for by just pointing to the right or the left. And that's what so many of my students and so many people in the United States want to do right now is like they want to situate where somebody's politics are so that they can already have a packaged understanding of where the writer or the thinker is coming from. And that is a problem. That's a kind of retreat into identity categories, and it produces bad reading and it produces bad thinking as well. It doesn't mean that you should not be committed to your political ideals. It's that when we're doing critical theoretical work, we cannot fall back into those kinds of conditions, right? We have to have that kind of critical flexibility that Horkheimer was describing in my last lecture. So when we look at Levinas's method of writing in this essay, he's going to be doing some things that are very Heideggerian. He's going to go back and he's going to give us this kind of history of Western civilization from an alternate kind of perspective. That's very Heideggerian. It's reading the whole tradition of history of philosophy as the history of philosophy. Now, of course, yeah, Marx was already like within the German critical tradition. Yes, like history is a big sort of thing. But as the saying sometimes goes, after Heidegger, all philosophy becomes the history of philosophy. Even the doing of philosophy can't be done without the history of philosophy. And that influence is definitely showing up in Levinas here. But as he encounters and tries to give a different perspective than his teachers whose thought has lended itself towards National Socialism, Levinas is going to say that at the basis of our philosophical thinking, we should not be having discussions about the meaning of life or ontology, first, the first philosophical questions we must ask are ethical ones, because before we ever come to knowing ourselves as rational subjects in our minds, before we're debating like free will or determinism or any of those things, we've already been living lives that are completely embedded in relationships to other people. He's not just going to say that we depend on other people in the sense that like yeah there's a way to think of sociality in the fact that like two people had to get together and have sex and have and the egg had to be fertilized in order for me to come into being. This is all before in vitro kind of fertilization stuff at this particular moment in time. And so yeah, some sort of human sociality had to begin with to produce me biologically. Some sort of human sociality had to be in place for me to know language. And Heidegger already knew that because Heidegger famously said, language speaks us. We don't come out inventing a whole language on our own. It's been socially produced for us, and it comes to dominate our cognitive neurological structure, to put it in more 21st century terms. Um, so those are definitely social ways of being that inform our lives before we become conscious of ourselves as egoistic subjects or even as rational subjects. That's only part of it, according to what Levinas is saying. Levinas is saying that there is fun of, with it's not just that I'm dependent, like that I'm comparing myself to an other, right? That produces like it's like, oh, when I know what's not me, then I come to know what I am. That's reflective consciousness, right? But he will say that even before that, there is a prior kind of relationship that with two others that calls me into being, and that because of that, I bear a kind of ethical responsibility to others. They're metaphysically grounded ethical conditions that situate my ability to be to begin with. Now, I just unpacked a lot more than maybe Levinas had even completely thought in this particular essay, but I think packaging it that way allows us to see kind of what's going on with him as he writes this, and it might give us some clarity as we dig into his essay. So let's dig into the essay now. He opens up again. This is 1934, and he's writing to Catholics. He's a Jewish person. Um, and he knows, and he's not like a lot of the critical theorists who are kind of secular Jews. They're not practicing Jews. Levinas has a Talmudic, Orthodox, we might say, Jewish background that he's coming from. Uh, Levinas says the philosophy of Hitler is simplistic, but the primitive powers that burn with it burst open its wretched phraseology under the pressure of an elementary force. They awaken the secret nostalgia within the German soul. Hitlerism is more than a contagion or a madness. It is an awakening of elementary feelings. Remember, phenomenology, especially Heideggerian phenomenology, wants to be able to give an account of feelings, right? Not just logic. But he's already given us a sense of like he's laying out logic versus feelings. Um, but he's also mentioned that there's a kind of force, um, and there's a force that opens up something old, something ancient, or at least the nostalgia for something ancient. Remember, Hitlerism is trying to claim things that, like, it has direct access to a kind of Aryan volkishness. So there is this kind of backwards looking and a self-construction of the German Volk, based on paganism, for some of them based on Christianity, as well. And so um, that's in the air as Levinas is writing this. He goes on, but from this point on, this frighteningly dangerous phenomenon becomes philosophically interesting. For these elementary feelings harbor a philosophy. They express the soul's principal attitudes towards the whole of reality and its own destiny. They predetermine or prefigure the meaning of the adventure that the soul will face in the world. Again, he's saying we need to take National Socialism and Nazism seriously as a philosophy, a nostalgic one at that, that embraces feelings, that embraces nostalgia, and that has a history and has a futurity to it, right? In a sense, this is very much like what the critical thinkers are doing, but he's much more abstract about it, right? He's not doing material history right here. He's doing a kind of intellectual history, a history of thought. He says the philosophy of Hitlerism therefore goes beyond the philosophy of the Hitlerians. Yeah, there are these bigots that are out there saying these things and doing these things in brown shirts, going beating people up. But there's something deeper and perhaps even more sinister at work here. It questions the very principles of civilization. The conflict is played out not only between liberalism and Hitlerism, although that's one thing, like the Weimar Republic and the Nazis. Christianity itself is threatened in spite of the careful attentions or concordats that the Christian churches took advantage of when Hitler's regime came to power. So he's saying, I know these agreements have been made, these treaties have been made, but I'm not even talking about that so much as I'm saying that Christianity itself is threatened. Now, just think of the power of a non Christian thinker writing to a Catholic audience and saying something like that, right? It is a serious statement, I would to say the least. He goes on, but it is not enough to follow certain journalists in distinguishing between Christian universalism and racist particularism. This is a question. Catholics are themselves asking this. Can we reconcile our Catholicism with the racism? Right. It's very important, as I've said in many lectures, and I say to my students over and over again, that Jews are discriminated against by Nazis on account of their race as Jews. It's not their religion. They are considered a different race. And the Nazi scientists, as I might be able to unpack in more detail in another lecture, the Nazi scientists by the mid 1930s know that there's no biological basis to be making these claims about race. But the Nazi party completely ignores the scientists themselves and sets up all sorts of tests and ways to determine someone's Jewishness and percentages of parents and grandparents and all of that kind of crap that is now scientifically bunk, right? Um, so that's where like when Levinas is talking about racist particularism, he's talking about this from the experience of a Jewish person who's experiencing anti-Semitism or anti-Jewishness as a racial discriminatory category, right? It's not enough, he says, to follow certain journalists in distinguishing between Christian universalism and racist particularism. Christian universalism would say we're all humans, we're all made by God. Um, that's not the way Kant and Hume and the Western philosophical tradition has treated it at all. If we look back at them, I've mentioned that in other lectures, but I'm not going to go into it in a great account here. Um, uh, but it is a question that comes with the birth of the nation state, as Hannah Arendt details in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism. With the nation state, with the French Revolution, there is the question, if we're not going to have, if we're going to break away from Christianity, what are we going to do with the non-Christian minorities in our culture? Are they going to become full citizens, right? And so the laws go back and forth, as we talked about with Marx way back in an earlier lecture, with Marx's own grandfathers who were rabbis, right? But his dad had to convert to Christianity in order to keep practicing law during that time in the early 1800s, after Napoleon comes back into power and we get, or comes into power, and we get these oppressive religious laws returning. Um, Nevertheless, by the 1930s here, the discussion is racial and not theological. Um, and it's a contested thing within Catholic or Christian communities who are trying to work this out. Levinas says a logical contradiction cannot judge a concrete event. The meaning of a logical contradiction that opposes two forms of ideas only shows up fully if we go back to their source, to intuition, to the original decision that makes them possible. It is in this spirit that we are going to set forth the following reflections. Intuition is a loaded word here, and it's loaded with phenomenology and husserl. Intuition is the kind of name that the phenomenologists will give to our encounter, our bodily encounter with the world. It's not just like what my mind thinks imaginatively. Its intuition is going to be attached to the matrix of the engagement of my physical sensation to the world around me. And that'll make sense as we go on in the essay here. Section 1. Political freedoms do not exhaust the content of the spirit of freedom, a spirit that in Western civilization signifies a conception of human destiny. This conception is a feeling that man is absolutely free in his relations with the world and the possibilities that solicit action from him. Man is renewed eternally in the face of the universe. Speaking absolutely, he has no history. Now, again, this is very gendered language. It's set up as quasi universal, but he's talking about the history of man, and he's using the language of European philosophy. So um, uh, for later gender theory, we can critique this kind of use of language, but right now my interest is to go with Levinas's own language, because he's talking in a kind of intellectual historical way. And he says that what Western civilization gives us is the conception of thinking of ourselves as a kind of species being, to use kind of Feuerbach's language. Or even in Aristotle is conditioning man as the animal who is capable of a rational hierarchy, where it's not just Aristotle, it's in Plato too, where our rational soul, that's the psyche is the Greek word that they use, but it gets translated as soul. That's a Christian concept, but in Plato and Aristotle, it's our rational capacity that gives a kind of executive oversight to um, our egoistic desires, our inclination to say yes or no, or our passions, our inclination to feel brave, our motivations. So there's a rationality over feelings, we might say, and over our base appetites of needing to eat and drink to live. It is a kind of definition of humanity or man, to use their gendered language here, that um, Western philosophy employs to give a definition of our species as humans. Now, of course, with that, there's slaves in Greek culture that they never talk about, right? There are barbarians who are less than human. And so there is that element as well. But what the Renaissance tradition and the humanist tradition picks up on, again, is our human capacity to reason. That becomes the ideological philosophy and the freedom with it, the individual freedom that produces bourgeois liberalism as well. The Kantian philosophy, the Lockean tradition, it is our rational capability, right? That eventually like wants to focus on the master relationship of the rational over the emotional, right? This is not the way current brain science thinks about what emotions are and how our brains work. Enlightenment philosophy is patently wrong about this kind of stuff. But maybe a discussion for a later time. So if it seems weird to be talking about this, like again, try to imagine being in the 1930s. And Levinas is working with this longer tradition that's dealing with this concept of Western civilization. Uh, So he says that Western civilization or Western philosophy gives us this idea of freedom, that there's something in our rational capacity that sets us free in a way different than maybe other animals, right? So it's that androcentrism, right? That anthropocentrism that is so characteristic of the Western tradition and especially the Euro-Christian tradition that sees humans as above the rest of animals. Indigenous worldviews do not work this way at all. In indigenous worldview, animals are our relatives. Animals are our older siblings. We owe responsibility to them, not in the Euro-Christian worldview that says that humans are the last and the pinnacle of God's creation, and therefore we lord above the other animals, or Genesis 1:28 will say, like we have dominion over them, right? That's part of the Western tradition, and there's something exceptional. There's something of the image of God, to use Euro-Christian terms, the imago in our souls being, right? That and part of that is aligned in the Western tradition with rational capability. And once we are thinking of rationality, if rationality is part of our soul and the soul is connected to God and the God is eternal, then the soul has no history because the soul is part of an eternal God and not part of the temporality of the lived existence and the unfolding of time. So being versus time kind of showing up there. Go on. For history is the most profound limitation, the fundamental limitation. Time, which is a condition of human existence, is above all a condition that is irreparable. The fate accomplished, swept along by a fleeing present, forever evades man's control, but weighs heavily on his destiny. Beneath the melancholy of the central flowing of things, Heraclitus's illusory present, that you can't step in the same river twice because the river keeps flowing, right? Um, Beneath the melancholy of eternal flow of things, Heraclitus's illusory present, there lies the tragedy of the irremovability of a past that cannot be erased and that condemns any initiative to being just a continuation. True freedom, the true beginning, would require a true present, which always at the peak of a destiny forever recommences that destiny. Because time is always flowing and we can't capture it, right? We're conditioned by temporality itself. True freedom would be the ability to overcome temporality itself. Heidegger says famously that humans are being toward death. We that's a little bit of an amplification of the Aristotelian notion that man is the political, rational animal who's capable of speaking politically and deliberating about the future. That's Aristotle's one of his definitions of human. Heidegger builds on that, and he says that not only are we rationally capably aware, what we are aware of as humans is that we will die someday. We don't necessarily know when we're going to die. I mean, maybe we could commit suicide, but in most cases, we don't know the time of our own death, but our own death will be the ownmost death, is the kind of way it's translated, that when I die, um, no one else can die for me. I know that Christian theology might have some other things to say about that, but my death is my own if I'm thinking about the structure of my being in the Heideggerian sense. And because I'm going to die someday, I'm structured in a linear temporality towards my death. And because I know I'm going to die, it makes this life precious because I know that it's finite in the Heideggerian structure of being, right? This is the phenomenological structure of how we exist. He calls it Dasein. Dasein is characterized by a being towards death. We are anticipating our own death, but we don't know when it's going to come. And that produces in us angst or anxiousness or nervousness. We don't know. It could be fear. And it leads us to question in Heidegger's thought, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life if I'm going to die anyway? All of those kinds of ontological questions, right? This is all kind of hovering behind Levinas here as he's following his own teacher, and of course, returning to the pre Socratic Greeks. True freedom would be a way to break out of that, right? And to recommit this side of where the origins of destiny comes from. Now he switches to Judaism, right? He's talked about Heraclitus. He's bringing in Judaism. He says Judaism bears this magnificent message: remorse, the painful expression of a radical powerlessness to redeem the irreparable, heralds the repentance that generates the pardon that redeems. Wow, almost this kind of almost feel theological, right? Man finds something in the present with which he can modify or efface the past. Time loses its very irreversibility. It collapses at the feet of man like a wounded beast, and he frees it. Judaism, in this characterization for Levinas, bears the tragedy of history, right? And if you think about being Jewish in a moment of, I mean, it's not like anti-Semitism is invented by the Nazis, right? It's just completely amplified, and it's becoming it's very much on the rise, and this cultural laws have just been put into it. So there is not really a view in the Jewish perspective here, especially from Levinas, that things are progressing and getting better, right? Not necessarily the case. That's not necessarily how history moves. But Judaism, as a theological system, um, uh, has an account of the radical powerlessness to redeem the irreparable, the thing that happened in the past, the rupture that happened in the past. The rupture for them is not original sin, just to contextualize it against the Christians. The rupture will mean something else. The fall in Judaism, for example, isn't being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The association of the rupture and the fall has to do with Noah and the ark. So I can't really go into that here, but just because I think most of my students come from some sort of quasi-Christian tradition, if they come from any religious tradition at all. But they tend to be Euro-Christian culturally and not know some of these things. So there's a lot more complexity to Judaism than I can give account of. And this is the only paragraph where Levinas in this essay talks about Judaism. But he says that within this within this religion, man finds something in the present which he can modify or efface, um, with which he can modify or efface the past. And that becomes a kind of fascination with the past that I think will characterize a lot of Jewish thought and Jewish thinking. We'll see it again with Walter Benjamin, another critical theorist who has this famous account of the angel of history, um, and time almost overflowing our heads so we can't see things unless we look back. um, the Hebrew verb that's being used here is that being invoked is actually the Hebrew verb that Jesus of Nazareth uses. Of course, Jesus is Jewish, right? He's a rabbi, he's a teacher. Um, and the word that gets translated by the Christians as repent, repent, it literally is the verb that means to turn back and look at things, turn back at the thing that cannot be undone, right? That's kind of what Levinas is invoking here. Um, shift to the next paragraph. Look how he shifts to the Greeks and the Christians. He's talking about Western civilization. He's giving us as a historical account. The burning feeling of natural powerlessness that man experiences in the face of time is what creates the whole tragedy of the Greek mora, the Greek fates, right? Um, who the whole acuteness of the idea of sin and the whole greatness of Christianity's rebellion. In contrast to the Atrides, this is Agamemnon and Menelaus's family, right? And the Iliad, and then the later the Oresteia uh, 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 cycle of plays, right? In contrast to the Atrides, who struggle in the grip of the strange and brutal past that afflicts them like a curse, Christianity puts forward a mystical drama. Greek tragedies, whether it's Oedipus, whether it's the Agamemnon, are about a fate that cannot be erased. Like the Mora, like it's going to happen to Oedipus no matter what Oedipus does. He can't escape our fate, his fate. And that's why even the gods are said to have pity on Oedipus, because he's got a really nasty kind of fate. But Christianity comes in and it brings this idea. Yes, it grows out of Judaism, which has this way of accounting for the past, but now he's characterizing Christianity as something a little bit different. Christianity puts forward a mystical drama. The cross sets one free, and through the Eucharist, which triumphs over time, this emancipation takes place every day. The salvation that Christianity wishes to bring us lies in the way it promises to reopen the finality brought about by the flow of moments of the past that is forever challenged, forever called into question, to go beyond the absolute contradiction of a past that is subordinate to the present. There's something in the mystical technology of Christianity that allows for a kind of freedom that Levinas is saying is very, very powerful. Through this, Christianity proclaims freedom and makes such freedom fully possible. Not only is the choice of destiny a free one, once the choice is made, it does not form a chain. Man retains the possibility, a supernatural possibility, certainly, but also a concrete and graspable one of terminating the contract into which he freely entered. That is an interesting phrase, into the contract that he was is this the Jewish covenant? The Berit? Is it the social contract? That's not exactly quite clear. Like, but I think that he really has more of a sense of a contract with a God here, or a covenant. At any moment, though, history, and remember Bergsound, how you can go back to anywhere in time. He says, at any moment, the Christian can regain the nudity he had at the beginning of the first days of creation. It is not easy to recover one's freedom. Such a plan can fail. It is not the effect of a capricious decree made by a will situated in an arbitrary world, but the depths of the effort required are a measure only of the seriousness of the obstacle and underline the originality of the new order that has been promised and achieved, an order that triumphs by tearing up the bedrock of natural existence. Ooh, deep stuff. This freedom, which is infinite with regards to any attachment, and through which no attachment is ultimately definitive, lies at the base of the Christian notion of the soul. While it remains a supremely concrete reality that expresses the ultimate foundation of the individual, this freedom has an austere purity that comes from a transcendent inspiration. Throughout the vicissitudes of the world's real history, the power of renewal gives the soul, in the Christian tradition, right, a noumenal character that is protected from the attacks launched by a world in which the concrete man nonetheless is placed. Of course, the Christians were discriminated against, with the Romans, right? But they seek in their claiming of their Christianness, in their witnessing, and that's martyr means to witness, right? And being a witness to their Christianity, they go to their own death, right? This is only apparently a paradox, says Levinas. The soul's detachment is not an abstract state. It is the concrete and positive power to become detached and abstract. The equal dignity of each soul and every soul, which is independent of the material or social conditions of people, does not flow from a theory that affirms, beneath individual differences, an analogy based on psychological constitution. It's due rather to the power given to the soul to free itself from what it has been, from everything that linked it to something or engaged it with something, so that it can regain its first virginity. And that happens for Christians through the dramatic event of the crucifixion, which kind of resets time. And of course, like most of us are using Euro-Christian temporality, right? And so it's this kind of philosophical, theological moment that Levinas is characterizing with the birth of Christianity, that gives this kind of notion of freedom, um, that one, if one takes it really seriously, one can see how deep it is. And so you can fail at trying to achieve that freedom, as he's said, right? So now we switch to liberalism here. If the liberalism of these last few centuries evades the dramatic aspects of such a liberation, it does retain one of its essential elements in the form of a sovereign freedom of reason. Descartes, Kant, sovereignty, and rationality. Not so much Schmittian there, right? Although I'm not sure that Schmidt would disagree. He might just say that the sovereign has the most reason or something like that. The whole philosophical and political form of modern times tends to place the human spirit on a plane that is superior to reality, and so creates a gulf between man and the world. In my own scholarship with my Native American colleague, my Washache or Osage Nation colleague, Tink Tinker, we characterize this as Euro-Christian worldview and Euro-Christian thought. And Levinas is giving, he doesn't use that terminology, but when I reread this essay for this week, I'm just like, whoa, Levinas is really giving us account of Western civilization that is completely inflected by Euro-Christianity, right? In the sense that liberalism as a political structure and the way he's characterized it is definitely an outgrowth of that Euro-Christian condition. But he's going to qualify it here. So let's go back to this paragraph, right? If the liberalism of these last few centuries evades the dramatic aspects of such a liberation, it does retain one of its essential elements in the form of the sovereign freedom of reason. The whole philosophical and political thought of modern times tends to place the human spirit on a plane that is superior to reality, and so creates a gulf between man and the world. That's that androcentric or anthropocentric Euro-Christian notion that human rationality is what makes them different than animals and sets them apart and makes them above. It's a hierarchical process, right? It's an up-down image schema, as my friend Tinker says. where he characterizes indigenous worldview as collateral egalitarian. There's no one is better, no species is better than another species in indigenous worldview. So it makes sense, or sorry, it makes it impossible to apply the categories of the physical world to the spirituality of reason, and so locates the ultimate foundation of the spirit outside the brutal world and the implacable history of concrete existence. The flesh is weak, but the spirit is strong, right? It places the blind world of common sense with uh, it replaces the blind world of common sense with the world rebuilt by idealist philosophy, one that is steeped in reason and subject to reason. In place of liberation through grace, there is autonomy, but the Judeo-Christian leitmotif of freedom pervades this autonomy. In my and my friend Tink's language, Euro-Christian worldview persists beneath the Enlightenment, self-congratulatory, liberal accounts of secularization narratives. Levinas is saying something very similar, but just using different language here. So liberalism erupts, we get the individual rights-bearing subject, but this is coming from Euro-Christianity itself. And it has and promotes a sense of autonomy and a sense of freedom that it is pulling from that Christian tradition. He's not giving us an account of Spinoza. And this is like I've sometimes had some discussions with some of my Jewish colleagues about like, what is Spinoza's role in the formation of political liberalism? And yes, like his Judaism is so important, Spinoza's is, and his theological political treatise is so important to be thinking of in the kind of matrix of what becomes political liberalism. But it's mostly the anti-Semitic or the anti-Jewish tonality that people, Christians who are reacting to Spinoza, even in Germany in the late 1700s, right? In my earlier lecture, where there's a Spinoza Renaissance, and he's the godless materialist kind of guy in their account. So yeah, they're reacting to Spinoza, and he's super important for the formation. But I think that I tend to go with Levinas's account that like what is pervading the political idea of liberalism and the birth of the nation state and the citizenship that cannot account for Jews is this kind of Euro-Christian notion of freedom and autonomy. So he's gone to liberalism, and that's again, Marx is saying something similar too. Rationalism and idealist philosophy takes on a kind of religiosity, takes on a kind of even form of Christianity that says that Christianity is the most evolved and the most rational, the most civilized sort of tradition. Marx and Feuerbach are going to like push against that. They're going to say like, no, the formation of world history or something like the way that history flows, religion is not the religion of the past. It's become this different form under bourgeois liberalism that has been captured in an ideological apparatus, to use a later Marxist thinker's terms, Althusser, it's become the tool of oppression by the ruling bourgeois class, um, and which is a different kind of form of what maybe medieval Christianity might be, right? So Marx and Feuerbach will be in there as well. And that's why Marx and Feuerbach characterize not just an allergy to religion, but they're saying that religion is not, it's been emptied of its own kind of power and religiosity by secular rationality. The French writers of the early 18th century, who were the precursors of democratic ideology and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, in spite of their materialism, confessed to being aware of a reason that exercises physical, psychological, and social matter. The light of reason was enough to chase away the shadows of irrationality. What remains of materialism when matter has been completely pervaded by reason? when everything has become the light of the Enlightenment and reason, and there are no shadows left, what else remains? And there's that kind of teasing with irrationality that Horkheimer was kind of getting at in the last bit of his essay that he says is within Kant himself, right? It's a sort of parallel there. Now, definitely a different way of articulating it, but it's the same phenomenon, I think, that Levinas is responding to. Sometimes when we talk about Jewish thought and Jewish thinkers, maybe of the late 19th century even, sometimes we use the term endarkenment as opposed to enlightenment. Because let's just face it, if you've been discriminated against for your Jewishness for like 1,000 years at least at this point, I mean, really, it's almost 2,000 years, but it really gets going after the Crusades. Um, I think you don't necessarily want to be out in public, right? Because like the public is going to be for you as a Jewish person is going to be the public after the 1215 Fourth Lateran Council that says that Jews and Muslims must wear externalized clothing to show that they're Jewish or Muslim so that Christians don't get confused and marry them. And that later that the star that the Nazis will force the Jews to wear, right, is exactly coming out of that tradition within Euro-Christianity of the Fourth Lateran Council. Also, the kind of like stereotypes of Jews having to wear hats or Jews being associated with professions of money because in medieval Christian times, Christians can't lend money to other Christians. And so the Jews are kept around so that they can be money lenders. But that creates a stereotype that Jews are somehow intrinsically attracted to money, right? It's the resentment of having to borrow money and not being able to pay it back, and then having resentment against the Jewish money lenders. But Jews in Christian society are forced into that position, and then they cannot be in other occupations, right? So it is the oppressive conditions of society that also become reified in the stereotypes that then become used to discriminate against Jews. It's like kind of the complex and very messed up and a effed up version of where racism comes from, right? And how it works. And I think that we do need to think, if we're thinking about the history of racism, we need to think about the way that the Jews are treated as a race, because later on, when we get modern skin color racism, which emerges from Euro-Christians saying that they're better because of their religiosity than other people. So it's not initially based on skin color, of course, right? But it becomes that with relation to Africans. And then to a certain extent, Native Americans or indigenous people are able to say sort of blend in or assimilate, or they're assumed that they're going to assimilate, or they get erased out of history in Euro-Christian perspectives. But when we're looking at the history of racism itself, um, uh, the persecution of Jewish people by the Euro-Christians shows us that as many philosophers have said like that racism as we know it is the birth of is birth within Western culture itself. Levinas is basically saying that in this essay. That's one of his main points here at the end that we haven't gotten to yet. But according to even modern scholars of race and the history of race, it's not that there weren't notions of different races in the ancient times, but race was considered more like in terms of language or something like that. And one race was not necessarily um, considered beneath another race on the basis of something like skin color. Of course, there are lots of people who think that their people are better than other people. Aristotle thinks that his people are better than the barbarians, for example, right? But there isn't a kind of classification system that is based on a kind of hierarchy of all of the races and then skin color being put into that. That's something that comes out of Euro-Christian accounts of and taxonomies of the world in the early modern and modern eras. back to this last paragraph of Levinas here. In the world of liberalism, man is not weighed down by history in choosing his destiny. He does not experience the possibilities open to him as a series of restless powers that seethe within him and already push him down a determined path. For him, they are only logical possibilities that present themselves to a dispassionate reason that makes choices while forever keeping its distance. That's bourgeois rationality for you. But it is a kind of freedom and rationality that seems to be aligned with people who think of themselves as Christians. Remember, Kant and Hume and these philosophers don't think that Africans have full rationality because they don't have, quote, civilization. Um, Jewish people can't participate fully as citizens in society. They don't have the rights and the freedom that is being characterized by the history of liberalism here. They don't get to choose their own destiny. In fact, they are destined to the tragedy, right? Not to the openness. And so, again, yes, it's in political form or in secularized form, but beneath it is that Christian notion of freedom. So Levinas has walked us up to the modern era at this point. He's walked us through accounts of the Cartesian turn towards rationalism and the birth of liberalism. And now he's going to turn to Marxism here. He says Marxism was the first doctrine in Western history to contest this view of man. Marxism no longer sees the human spirit as pure freedom or a soul floating above any attachment. The spirit is no longer a pure reason that partakes in the realms of ends. It is prey to material needs. But as it is at the mercy of a matter and a society that no longer obey the magic wand of reason, its concrete and servile existence has more weight and importance than does impotent reason. The struggle that pre-exists intelligence imposes decisions on the latter, which it had not taken. Um, Being determines consciousness. Science, morality, and aesthetics are not moral, scientific, or aesthetic in themselves, but at every moment translate the basic opposition between the bourgeois civilization and the proletarian one. This is his account of Marxism, right? It's not our rationality and our idealist structures. Our rationality and our political economic structures are but the outgrowth of the material economic conditions in which we exist. And therefore, our sense of what is art, what is rational, what is aesthetic, what is moral is something that develops an ideology. And the ideology is forced upon us by the ruling classes, right? The traditional view of spirit loses its power. So this is, again, when he said the traditional view of spirit, this is very much the same thing that Horkheimer was saying in the traditional theory. The traditional view of spirit is rational enlightenment thought, capital R reason. Levinas says the traditional spirit under Marxism, the traditional view of spirit loses the power to undo all the links of which it had been so proud. It collides with mountains that no faith in itself could shake. Absolute freedom, the type that works miracles, for the first time finds itself banished from the spirit's constitution. Liberalism gives us rationality, but with it, it also breaks us away from God, breaks us away from theology, secularization. We just live in this contemporary time. Even in Spinoza's theological political treatise, he says that what characterizes our historical age in the 1600s is that God has sort of left the building. God doesn't intervene in miracles anymore. Remember, Schmidt said that exception in jurisprudence is the miracle in theology, right? He wants to return. He has a nostalgia for a place not only where there is a strong sovereign, but where that strong sovereign is God's presence on earth, right? Absolute freedom in the rationalist enlightenment sense, Levinas is saying here, absolute freedom, the type that works miracles for the first time, finds itself banished under enlightenment reason, right, from the spirit's constitution. As a result, Marxism, um, uh, if our rational capability from the Enlightenment is not really an access point to our freedom, but really just a kind of false consciousness born out of our economic conditions under Marx, as Marxism puts it, then um, we're in a whole different kind of condition, right? As a result, Marxism is opposed not just to Christianity, but to the whole of idealist liberalism, wherein being does not determine consciousness, but consciousness is, or reason determines being. And the Cartesian rationalist, Enlightenment, bourgeois, liberalism idea, consciousness determines being. And Marxism, being and our material conditions determine consciousness. As a result, Levinas says, as a result of this, Marxism stands in opposition to European culture, or at least breaks the harmonious curve of its development. That's his account of Marxism. So we know, like, Levinas is not exactly a Marxist. He's certainly not a Schmittian. He's not a critical theorist. Like, how do we think about this guy? And at the same time, he says, this break with liberalism is not a definitive one. In a certain sense, Marxism consciously continues the traditions of 1789, and the Jacobinism seems in large measure to inspire Marxist revolutionaries. So, especially the terror, right? Especially the violence that emerges in and throughout the French Revolution, and the left leaning that we now call it, right? Because of the Jacobins. That's where we get left and right, is from the French Revolution, and where people were sitting as they were trying to work out the revolution. Um, uh, and so that kind of horizontal political spectrum. So now, like, Levinas is taking a different tack on Marxism. Yeah, Marxism is in some ways like so critical and anti-European in some ways, but it's also an outgrowth of that. So he says, but above all, if the basic intuition of Marxism consists in perceiving that the spirit to have an inevitable relation to a determined situation, this link is in no way a radical one. Individual consciousness determined by being is not sufficiently impotent not to retain, at least in principle, the power to shake off the social bewitchment that then appears foreign to its existence. To become conscious of one's own social situation is, even for Marx, to free oneself from the fatalism entailed by that situation. Remember, in my last lecture, I was saying that, like, there's a way to think about Horkheimer as critiquing a kind of bourgeois element in Marx. Yes, Marxism says that, like, yes, and even critical theory says this, and I think Levinas would say this critically about that we us critical theorists, that, like, there is a rational element that says that, like, that hopes that we can, if we can do our material historical analysis, that we can break free, right? That we can open up and change society in a particular way. And so Marxism has that as well. Um, but Marx, so Marx, yes, says that we are determined by our physical conditions, but there is that moment of consciousness that creates the coalescence of the species at the, or the class anyway, of the proletarians at a particular level, that moment of cohesion that then forces the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then, of course, the withering away of the state, as Lenin and Engels and Marx had sort of termed it. So that process, because there's a futurity, because there's a kind of linearness to it, there is something, I think Levinas is saying, that is comes out of the Euro-Christian tradition or the European tradition. And some of us, like in contemporary times, like my colleague Tink and I, will say, yeah, there is something within Marxism that maintains a Euro-Christian worldview, in the sense that it presents itself as a kind of salvation narrative, right? There will be this future time, it's not maybe the second coming of Christ, but it's the coming of the revolution in which we enter into this kind of communal, kind of quasi-heavenly type of existence, right? Of course, it's in this world and not in heaven, under the materialist conditions, but the structure of the temporality is still Euro-Christian for us, even though, yes, Marx is against, quote, Christianity as the religion of the bourgeois. So, a view that it was truly opposed to the European notion of man would be possible only if the situation to which he was bound was not added to him, but formed at the very foundation of his being. This paradoxical requirement is one is one that the experience of our bodies seems to fulfill. This is like really nice transition paragraph. He's going to say that what the Euro-Christian tradition or the rationalist tradition, the tradition of this absolute freedom has ignored is the body. Um, Another way of thinking of this, like, is again to use my indigenous colleague Tink Tinker will say, like when somebody says they're an atheist, Tink will say, well, they're a Euro-Christian atheist, right? To have the identity concept of being atheist, not believing in God, right? Like you already have to have a concept of God to begin with in order to reject that God. For indigenous peoples who did not have a concept of God to begin with, it doesn't really work to say call them atheists. They just don't have the concept to begin with. But the Euro-Christian conditions of culture and secularization and Enlightenment reason produce this category of the person who rejects the belief in the Euro-Christian God, the monotheistic God, right? It's only the drama of that particular kind of cultural history among various different, you know, the French culture, German culture, um, English culture. Beneath that is the Euro-Christian worldview, according to my analysis with my colleague, Dr. Tinker. So that's another way of thinking, like that identity categories will not get us to what really situates worldview here. Levinas, in his analysis, turns to the body. Remember, he's been trained kind of as a phenomenologist as well. So the body, it becomes really important in here. He says, what does it mean to traditional interpretations to have a body? Traditional in the same sense that Horkheimer meant, traditional theory, bourgeois rationalism, which places all the emphasis in the mind. Um, What does it mean to traditional interpretations to have a body? It means tolerating it as an object of the external world. It weighs on Socrates like the chains that weigh him down in the prison in Athens. It encases him like the very tomb that awaits him. The body is an obstacle. It breaks the free flight of the spirit and drags it back down to earthly conditions. And yet, like an obstacle, it is to be overcome. In the very funny movie, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, by the Terry Gilliam movies with Robin Williams, and is characterizing these rationalist, this moment in philosophy by the heads literally detaching from the bodies and flowing off into space, and the bodies running around and trying to have sex with each other. This is a really funny way of accounting for that. But Levinas's situation, this all the way going back to Socrates. He says, this is the feeling of the eternal strangeness of the body in relation to us that has nurtured Christianity as much as modern liberalism. It is the Neoplatonian or uh, the Platonic philosophy that influences the uh, Neoplatonists, excuse me, such as Saint Augustine in Christian theology. When they bring Greek philosophy into their accounts of what becomes original sin in Augustine, right? That is very different. The Christian notion of sin is completely different from Hebrew notions of sin. Yes, you can be in sin and you might need to go do a mikvah, or mikvah, and like you might have to do a spiritual bath or something like that. But you are not morally retrograde when you're in sin in the Jewish tradition. The moral attachment to sin is something that comes with the Euro-Christian tradition, right? Even though Augustine is from North Africa, he's dealing with a Christianity that has situated itself its as its center in Rome, right? That's what makes it Euro-Christian. There. Levinas says this feeling of eternal strangeness in the body in relation to us that is nurtured, it is that feeling that has nurtured Christianity as much as modern liberalism. It is this feeling that has persisted throughout every variation in ethics, and in spite of the decline suffered by the ascetic ideal since the Renaissance. If the materialists confused the self with the body, it was at the price of a pure and simple negation of the spirit. They placed the body in nature and accorded it no exceptional standing in the universe. But the body is not only something eternally foreign. Classical interpretations relegate to an inferior level and regard as a stage to be overcome a feeling of identity between our bodies and ourselves, which certain circumstances render particularly acute. Not only is it the case that the body is closer and more familiar to us than the rest of the world and controls our psychological life, our temperament, and our activities. Beyond these banal observations, there is the feeling of identity. Do we not affirm ourselves in the unique warmth of our bodies, longing before any blossoming of the self that claims to be separate from the body? Again, remember how I was saying at the beginning of the lecture, he wants to give us an account of ethics as first philosophy before consciousness, before like he's doing that right here with the body in this paragraph. Aren't we embodied first before we become aware of ourselves to think, ask the question, like, what does it mean to exist, right? Do these links that blood establishes prior to the birth of intelligence not withstand every test? This is getting really interesting here. It's like biology maybe is coming in here. In a dangerous sport or risky exercise in which gestures attain an almost abstract perfection in the face of death, all dualism between the self and the body must disappear. In the impasse of physical pain, is it not the case that the sick man experiences the indivisible simplicity of his being when he turns over in his bed of suffering to find the position that gives him peace? This is so phenomenological, right? This is like when like later Sartre is going to write a famous book called Nausea, and it's about all of this embodied feeling. It's like what when we're nauseous, like it takes over our whole being. He's getting that right from Levinas and right from the phenomenological tradition, which is giving attention to our embodiment. This is also in Heidegger as well, right? Um, but we can see that Levinas in that last paragraph is also attaining or situating embodiment as prior to the formation of the rational self that's so privileged by the liberal tradition and that has been privileged in the asceticism of Christianity, right? And with that asceticism, with that liberalism, is not only rationalism, but also a concept of freedom that becomes more detached from the ability to look back into time and to the tragic moment that it is within religiosity and becomes kind of emptied out of itself in modern philosophy. He says, analysis can we not say that analysis reveals in pain the spirit's opposition to this pain, a rebellion or a refusal to remain within it, and consequently an attempt to go beyond it? Pain gives us information, right? But is it not the case that this attempt is characterized from the beginning as as desperate, does not the rebelling spirit remain ineluctably locked within pain? Isn't it pain that tells the spirit that it wants to break free from the body? And again, this is like the agony of the cross, right? Like that's in the background here as well. And is it not this despair that constitutes the very foundation of pain? There's a temporality to those words, despair and desperate, waiting, right? Alongside the interpretation given of these facts by traditional Western thought, Levinas says here, facts that it calls crude and unrefined, and that it manages to diminish, the feeling can remain that they possess an irreducible originality and that one wishes to maintain their purity. Physical pain can reveal an absolute position. You're so enraptured in the pain, right? I do yoga almost every day, right? You get into those yoga positions where it's like you're not thinking about your outside life anymore when you're in like a really hard stretch or a really hard pose. There's something about the pain of the body that brings our consciousness into unification with the body. The body is not only a happy or unhappy accident that relates us to the implacable world of matter. Rather, its adherence to the self is of value in and of itself. The body, our self is infused in our body for Levinas. It is an adherence that one does not escape, and that no metaphor can confuse with the presence of an external object. It is a union that does not in any way alter the tragic character of finality. Think about that again. Remember the Jewish perspective. Remember that the Jew is being discriminated against, the Jew who's being beat up, the Jews who are going to, in a few years, be going to concentration camps, right? And that tragic character of finality is because of their embodiment. It's not because of their religion, it's not because of their spirit, it's because of their embodiment, right? This, the unfolding of history from this perspective is not progressive, it is tragic. This feeling of identity between self and body, which naturally has nothing in common with popular materialism, will therefore never allow those who wish to begin with it to rediscover in the depths of this unity the duality of a free spirit that struggles against the body to which it is chained. On the contrary, for such people, Jewish people, on the contrary, for such people, the whole of the spirit's essence lies in the fact that it is chained to the body. For the liberal rationalist bourgeois person, it's like, I can totally be in my abstract freedom because I've got the privileges of my citizenship. I've got the privileges of what a secularized, rational Euro-Christian society can give to me. If you're not part of that, you're F, you're screwed, right? um, uh, and you don't get to participate in that freedom, that abstract freedom of liberalism. To separate the spirit from the concrete forms with which it is already involved, Levinas says, is to betray the originality of the very feeling from which it is appropriate to begin. Now, at the same time, there is something to be said about like, it's like the people who don't get to embrace that kind of liberal privilege or the Christian freedom or something like that. There is something primordial that Levinas is saying is in our embodiment, right? It's something that's been left out of the Western civilization tradition as it's gone more and more towards rationality. Turning back to the next paragraph. The importance attributed to this feeling for the body with which the Western spirit has never wished to content itself is at the basis of a new conception of man. Okay. We're entering the 19th century now. We're entering the 1800s, right? We're entering biological notions of race. The biological with the notion of inevitability it entails, genealogy, Darwin, all of that sort of stuff, becomes more than an object of spiritual life. It becomes its heart. The mysterious urgings of the blood, the appeals of heredity, and the past for which the body serves as an enigmatic vehicle lose the character of being problems that are subject to the solution put forward by a sovereignty of free self. 19th century biology has directed us back to bodies, to genealogy, to concepts of biological race, right? So not only does the self bring in the unknown elements, because it's our scientific rationality, the priority of that capital S self, that's given us the biological science, that's allowed us to make microscopes and technology and all of the things that allow us to have this new scientific way of thinking about the world. It's all built part of our in that hierarchical rational structure that, going back to Plato and Aristotle, is the highest capacity of our being, right? Not only does the self bring in the unknown elements of these problems in order to resolve them, Kantian apperception, right? The self is also constituted by these elements. Man's essence no longer lies in freedom, but in a kind of bondage. To be truly oneself does not mean taking flight for once more above contingent events that have always remain foreign to the self's freedom. On the contrary, it means becoming aware of the ineluctable original chain that is unique to our bodies, and above all, accepting this chaining. Think about the beginnings of nationalism in the 19th century, of what makes a people, or a folk, what makes a people, what unites people in their nationalism. Is it some sort of concept of blood, right? Because that concept of blood and soil for the Hitlerian philosophy is going to be the way that they discriminate against Jews on the basis of race, right? From this point on, every social structure that announces an emancipation with respect to the body without being committed to it is suspected of being a repudiation or a betrayal. The forms of a modern society founded on the harmony established between free wills will seem not only fragile and inconsistent, but false and deceitful. Nationalism becomes tied to blood and soil. Nationalism becomes tied to genealogy. Cosmopolitan, like the meeting of the minds of different cultures, we can't have that. That's false. There needs to be this re-entrenchment into a pure sort of body public, right? And that will become, for the Nazis, their sort of version of Aryanism. The forms of a modern society founded on the harmony established between free wills will seem not only fragile and inconsistent, but false and deceitful. Nazism's going to say liberalism, no way. Freedom, no way. There has to be something deeper that holds people together for the Nazis. The assimilation of spirits loses the grandeur of the spirit's triumph over the body. Instead, it becomes the work of forgers. A society based on the consanguinity, the same blood, right, immediately ensues from this concretization of the spirit. And then, if race does not exist, one has to invent it. That is that's a profound line in this essay. If race doesn't exist, one has to invent it. And of course, race was already existing, but we know that in the 19th century, this new biological version of race has emerged. It's emerged in the economic, material conditions of the new nation state formations that talk about bodies of citizenship, that talk about a nation and what makes up that national body. And then the question in that particular moment, especially after the French Revolution, becomes, what do we do with the Jews if we're not in a Christian nation anymore? If the nation state has broken away from the church, truly speaking, then what do we do with the non-Christians, the others of former times? Well, what happens as a new concept of race based on blood, biology is invented. And then that becomes the more insidious way of determining purity and impurity that gives birth to racism, right? The ideal of man in society is accompanied by a new ideal of thought and truth. What characterizes the structure of thought and truth in the Western world, as we have already stressed, is the distance that initially separates man from the world of ideas in which he will choose his truth. He is free and alone in the face of this world. He is free to the point of being able not to cross this distance and not to make a choice. Skepticism is a basic possibility within the Western spirit, like the Cartesian skepticism, right? But once the distance has been crossed and the truth grasped, man nonetheless retains his freedom. Man can regain control and go back on his choice within the affirmation of the future negation. So within the affirmation, the future negation is already brewing. Marxism will say that too, right? The Marxists turn for Hegelianism. It's being brewed. Marxism materialism is, according to their own account, being bred within the Hegelian spirit, where idealism has become seen to be the ideological sham that it is, where religion is the ideological sham that it is, and materialism. This is just a dialectical process that is part of the Western philosophical thought tradition, right? Levinas says this freedom constitutes the whole of thought's dignity, but it also harbors its danger. And the gap that separates man from the world of ideas, deceit insinuates itself. Thought becomes a game. We're just rational subjects in our Berkeleyan worlds. We don't have attachment to God. We're relegated to this notion of human freedom. We might tie that human freedom again, we might have the opportunity to consciously tie it to something like soil or a biological notion of race that we have invented with our scientific discourses. Man revels in his freedom and does not definitively compromise himself with any truth. He transforms his power to doubt into a lack of conviction. Man, not to chain himself to a truth becomes for him not wishing to commit his own self to the creation of special spiritual values. This is the secular world. This is the bourgeois rational world, right? This is the scientific world. We have options. Sincerity becomes impossible and puts an end to all heroism. Civilization is invaded by everything that is not authentic, by a substitute that is put at the service of fashion and the various interests. This would correspond to something like Nietzsche's claims about nihilism, right? The death of metaphysics, the death of God, late 19th century. Such a society, Levinas goes on, loses living contact with the true ideal of freedom and accepts degenerate forms of the ideal. It does not see that the true ideal requires effort and instead enjoys those aspects of the ideal that make it life easier. Again, this is exactly the kind of critique that Feuerbach is making of religion under Hegelianism, religion that has been turned into just an ideological appendage of state oppressive control. The modern state is a modern invention. It's an invention of a tool of oppression. Levinas has said that with liberalism, with modernity, freedom exists. Yes, it is tied in a Euro-Christian and Western tradition that is much older, but it is kind of forgotten. The difficult freedom, to invoke that's the name of a later Levinas essay. It has forgotten that what the Christ moment really meant, if you took it seriously, was a much more deep and profound and mystical version of what freedom could actually be. But modern secular society keeps promoting freedom as this political category, emptied of all of that spirit, and only in terms of either rational bourgeois ideology or a secular materialist consumerist um, rejection of all things spiritual. He says it is to a society in such a condition that the Germanic ideal of man seems to promise sincerity and authenticity. In those materialistic conditions, the Germanic ideal to the Hitlerians, right? They say we want to recover that kind of lost essence of Christianity. Even back in my earlier lectures, right? The way I was characterizing what German philosophical thought was trying to account for something missing in Enlightenment thought, they want to hold on to Christian piety. That's part of the German ideal here. And it's part of what makes Nazism appealing is that in that nostalgic moment for Levinas, it makes people feel sincere and authentic in an otherwise materialist, enlightenment based world of modernity where belief has become cheapened, where nobody really believes in religion anymore. All of a sudden, there is this other thing to tap into. That's what Hitlerism does. Man no longer finds himself confronted by a world of ideas in which he can choose his own truths on the basis of a sovereign decision made by his free reason. He is already linked to a number of these ideas, just as he is linked by birth to all those who are of his blood. He doesn't need to think for himself anymore because he's part of a Volk. He's part of a nation, part of something bigger. He's part of um, the group, the society that the Marxian and other philosophical modes of thought have been telling us. And throughout the 19th century, they've been obsessed with the determining um, the situation of human beings as a group, right? And by a lot, the pseudo biology of this time is attributing it to blood. He can no longer play with the idea for coming from his concrete being, anchored in his flesh and blood. The idea remains serious. We've moved out of the bourgeois liberalism and into the Volk culture. And we don't need to have rationality in the Volk culture, right? That's what Hitlerism and the philosophy of Hitlerism says. Chained to his body, man sees himself refusing the power to escape from himself. Truth is no longer for him the contemplation of a foreign spectacle. Instead, it consists in a drama in which man is himself the actor. It is under the weight of his whole existence, which includes facts on which there is no going back. The man will say his yes or his no. There's something old in this embodiment. There's something deep. And with that depth of embodiment, there's the inescapableness of a tragic history. That is, of course, also part of the Western tradition, right? But to what does this sincerity bind man? Any rational assimilation or mystical communion between spirits that is not based on a communion of blood, it becomes suspect. Again, for the new Volk, for the Germanic disposition, for the Hitler followers, right? All of a sudden, in this new condition, your sincerity of feeling authentic is based on your perception of your ties to blood. And anybody from a different kind of blood is automatically suspect, i.e., the Jews, right? And yet, this new type of truth cannot renounce the formal nature of truth and cease to be universal. It's saying that we are the true humanity, that there's the claim, universal claim, but it's also in that idea of the universal, there's a kind of boundary around it. In vain, its truth In vain is truth my truth in the strongest sense of the possessive pronoun, for it must strive towards the creation of a new world. I have to lose myself in my truth into the Volk, right? Zarathustra was not content with his transfiguration. Instead, he came down from the mountain bringing a gospel with him. How is universality compatible with racism? The answer to be found in the logic of what first inspires racism involves a basic modification of the very idea of universality. Universality must give way to the idea of expansion. For the expansion of a force presents a structure that is completely different from the propagation of an idea. For the expansion of a force presents a structure that is completely different from the propagation of an idea. It's an internalized purity that says everything that is this is, quote, universal. And with that, it also creates not only the kind of boundaries of something outside of it, but the necessity to cover the rest of the world. Something like imperialism, right? Like there's the formation under the National Socialism of the national state, and immediately there's the imperial impulse of Hitlerism to conquer the rest of Europe, right? The idea propagated detaches itself essentially from its point of departure. In spite of the unique accent communicated to it by its creator, it becomes a common heritage. It is fundamentally anonymous. People in the United States, the white supremacists in the United States, the Euro Christians in the United States who are concerned about the invaders from the border down south. It is exactly the same sort of formation, right? I mean, they're colonizers to begin with. They've forgotten their own history. They don't give a crap about indigenous peoples who were here before them because they've created a logical structure that they've attached to their Euro-Christian secularized governmental apparatus, liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy, and then they want to insulate within their pure identity category that they've created for themselves an idea that they are being invaded by other people, right? That is the same formulation that is going on with the German Volk in the past, right? Now, the Germans think that they're being invaded by other people too. So the Germans actually, like Hitler, like they have a fascination with like Native Americans and stuff because they feel like the Native Americans live this purer way of life and they're being bulldozed by the liberals, right? So there's all sorts of weird kinds of crossovers there. Um, uh, um, uh, the nationalism in the United States today is very much the same sort of thing. The emphasis on common heritage, the emphasis on Euro-Christianity as part of that heritage, and tied with that, immediately tied to that, is a notion of white supremacy, right? Is a notion of racial superiority. It's not new, it's the same thing. It's just kind of moved around, and it's not the way we've normally maybe conceived of things as liberals in the United States in our self-congratulatory narratives. Um, he goes on, it's fundamentally anonymous. The person who accepts it becomes its master, as does the person who proposes it, the person who becomes the Proud Boy, the person who becomes like once you adopt it, like notice like the new far right folk, like young men who are getting plastic surgery, for example, to all have the same face, right? Um, it's an embrace of anonymity, right? It's aestheticized in a particular way, for sure. Um, uh, a person is both anonymous and master at once because they've joined into the superiority of their notion of race. The propagation of this idea, to come back to Levinas here, the propagation of an idea thus creates a community of, quote, masters. It is the process of equalization. To convert or persuade is to create peers. The universality of an order in Western society always reflects this universality of truth. We could take that back to evangelical impulses in Christianity as well. Christianity tries to make over the world, at least in its Euro-Christian form, tries to make over the entire world in Christendom, the Christian domination, right? The dominate in Latin, which is considered a good thing, by the way, in medieval and colonial Europe, right? It will go over the entire world and it will civilize it and it will convert all of the natives and everybody else into Christianity, into a kind of sameness. That impulse becomes the same impulse of empire under Rome. It also, under the racialized impulses of the late 19th century, become a part of white supremacy as we know it today. Um, that often is tied in terms of worldview to Euro-Christian supremacy, because that's where whiteness kind of comes from. But force is characterized by another type of propagation. The person who exerts force does not abandon it. Force does not disappear among those who submit to it. It is attached to the personality or society exerting it, enlarging that person or society while subordinating the rest. Force here is the thing that the fascist embraces in the movement towards the fascism, right? It's the dropping out of rationalism, the going along with the feeling. And by going along with that feeling, you merge with it. You become bigger. You become more powerful. You are no longer an individual, right? That's the appeal, especially to people who've been beaten in a war, people who've felt like uh, people have been looking down on them for some reason, whether it's economically for white people and many white people in the United States who feel like that they were promised something that they didn't get. There's a new movement, there's a reclaiming movement to go back and make America great again, or to take back this thing that they perceived as theirs, with all the at the same time having totally erased the idea that Euro Christians have dominated and erased indigenous peoples. There's no conception of that, because within their universalism of their own racialized self, they are the supreme beings. They emerge with the force of their particular movement. Nobody else matters. Everybody else who's outside is an invader. Um, Here, the universal order is not established as a consequence of ideological expansion. It is the very expansion that constitutes the unity of the world masters and slaves. Nietzsche's will to power, which modern Germany is rediscovering and glorifying again in the 1930s here for Levinas, is not only a new ideal, it is an ideal that simultaneously brings with it its own form of universalization, war and conquest. But here we return to well-known truths. We've tried to link in this essay, he says, we've tried to link them to a fundamental principle. Perhaps we have succeeded in showing that racism is not just opposed to such and such a particular point in Christian and liberal culture. It's not a particular dogma concerning democracy or parliamentary government or dictatorial regime or religious politics that is in question. It is the very humanity of man. Really powerful letter. Is racism built into the heart of the Western tradition and its tradition of the way that it is characterized man as having this attribute called humanity. And with that attribute of humanity is the rational capacity. So that's Levinas's critique, and powerful one that it is. One of the other reasons I have invoked it in this course is because he's saying this in 1933, and it's not until the mid 1940s that we're going to see the critical theorists, especially Adorno and Horkheimer, taking up this longer intellectual critique of Western civilization in their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, where they try to go and trace back totalitarian impulses in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and so I wanted to invoke Levinas because to show that he's already doing that sort of thing. Of course, the right wing in the United States who hate the critical theorists say that what the critical theorists bring to the United States in that moment is a critique of Western civilization. And they always want to say Western civilization gave us all these good and these big things. And especially they gave us the notion of freedom to begin with. But they are not doing they're not attending to the rigorous kind of attention that Levinas has given to uh, his account of Enlightenment culture or Marx's account of Enlightenment culture, and says that that is an outgrowth of this other thing. Nor is it giving account to much more recent philosophers, not just philosophers, but I'm thinking of a religious studies, a history of religions expert at Oxford right now named Guy Strumsa, who has a book called The Idea of Semitic Monotheism, a couple of other books, Guystromsa, who really has says that when we really look back at the Enlightenment and that shift from early modernity and religiosity to the Enlightenment secularization, that when we look really closely, that's where the rhetoric of so-called Western civilization comes from. So that narrative look back is actually coming from bourgeois Enlightenment culture. But the conservatives who say that these nihilistic critical theorists are coming in and they've destroyed our university system and they've brought with them their nihilism and their critique and their negativity about Western civilization. They are buying into the ideology that notion of Western civilization is much, much older. So that's just some food for thought to be thinking about in terms of some current criticism there. I find Levinas's essay really, really powerful because, of course, he's writing this before the Holocaust, right? He's writing this when Hitler has just come into power, and whether you agree with him completely or not, is sort of beside the case. Like the tonality of tragedy that he's able to bring here to Catholic readers as a Jewish thinker is nothing less than remarkable, if you ask me. And of course, I did my master's thesis on Levinas, and maybe I'm just on my Levinas kick tonight. But I wanted to do a reading there, and I hope you got something out of it. Um, uh, and as always, uh, if you are getting things out of these lectures and feel like supporting us on Patreon, this is the Critical Theory Center is really just me right now. I have other colleagues that are interested in stuff, but I have no way to you know pay other people for lectures and things like that. So it's just me that you're getting right now. We will go on in the next reading and the next lecture with Wendy Brown, an essay from a few years ago on neoliberalism. So we're jumping into the contemporary times, and then we will go to Glenn-Sean Coulthard, who's Yellow Knives Dene, an indigenous person, as well. So we're skipping from the 1930s classical critical theorists and then Levinas into contemporary times and discussions of neoliberalism, and an indigenous reconfiguring of some of Marx's ideas. And then we'll go back to the Frankfurt School and the 60s and things that happened in the 20th century. But I've spent these first like 12 lectures in the beginning part of class, really situating the beginnings of critical theory, what's at stake for the Frankfurt School, what constitutes in my last lecture the methodologies of critical theorists. Now I've given us a completely different angle of someone whose politics we can't easily situate, and a Jewish perspective that embraces theology, or at least ethics in a way that I don't think that critical theorists have up to this point reading it have really invoked. Although later on, Hannah Arendt and ethics, the banality of evil, the ethical terminology is going to come up again later on in our readings this semester. Thank you very much, as always, for watching, listening, paying attention. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whenever, wherever you are. Bye.